History books love their grand narratives, the rise and fall of empires, the battles that decided nations, the towering figures whose names echo through the ages. But what about the moments that slipped through the cracks, the quiet, overlooked events that didn't make it into the spotlight, yet somehow changed everything? Imagine a world where the smallest decision, the most unexpected discovery, or even a single misunderstood omen sent civilizations down paths no one could have predicted. That's the hidden heartbeat of history, the forgotten pulses that shaped the ancient world in ways we're only just beginning to understand. Take a step back and think about how many stories have been lost to time. Not just the tales of kings and conquerors, but the ordinary moments that rippled outward, bending the course of human destiny. A scribe misinterpreting a prophecy. A trader taking a wrong turn and stumbling upon a city no one knew existed. A storm that wiped out an entire fleet, altering the balance of power forever. These aren't just footnotes, they're the silent architects of the world we live in today, buried under layers of dust and dismissed as mere coincidence. But what if they weren't? That's where our journey begins. Today, we're uncovering 30 of these forgotten events, each one a missing puzzle piece in the grand tapestry of ancient history. From the mysterious collapse of civilizations that vanished overnight to the bizarre inventions that were centuries ahead of their time, these are the stories your textbooks skip. The kind that make you wonder how much of what we think we know is just the tip of the iceberg. So settle in, because we're about to peel back the layers and reveal the astonishing, the unsettling, and the utterly unexpected moments that quietly shaped the ancient world and still echo in ours today. One of history's most explosive turning points began with a single, earth-shattering moment, the eruption of Thera. Picture an island, now Santorini, thriving at the heart of the Mediterranean, bustling with Minoan trade and culture. Then, in an instant, the ground split open, unleashing a force 4 times more powerful than Krakatoa. The sky darkened for days as ash rained down across the region, burying cities, choking crops, and sending tsunamis crashing into Crete just 70 miles away. The Minoan civilization, once the envy of the ancient world with its grand palaces and intricate frescoes, never fully recovered, but the fallout didn't stop there. The disaster reshaped trade routes overnight, diverting wealth and influence toward rising powers like Mycenaean Greece. Even more fascinating, this cataclysm might have seeded one of history's greatest legends, the story of Atlantis. Plato described a mighty island nation swallowed by the sea in a single day, its people punished for their arrogance. The parallels are uncanny. A sophisticated maritime society, sudden annihilation. Even the circular layout of Thera's caldera mirroring Plato's description of Atlantis. Coincidence, or could this be the real-life disaster that morphed into myth over centuries of retelling? What's often overlooked is how Thera's eruption didn't just destroy, it rerouted destiny. With Minoan ports in ruins, Egypt and the Near East turned to new partners, accelerating the rise of mainland Greek city-states. The volcanic winter that followed may have even triggered famines as far away as China. A single geological event rippling across continents, quietly setting the stage for the classical world to come. All this from a catastrophe so immense, its echoes still linger, not just in the earth, but in the stories we tell about civilizations lost and found. Just when the ancient world seemed unstoppable, empires flourishing, trade networks stretching from the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia, everything fell apart in what we now call the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BCE, in the span of a single generation, nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean crumbled. The mighty Hittite Empire vanished. Mycenaean Greece's grand palaces burned to the ground. Egypt barely clung on, fending off waves of mysterious invaders known only as the Sea Peoples. Cities that had thrived for centuries were abandoned, their streets silent, their knowledge lost. This wasn't just a decline, it was a full reset of human society. So what caused such a catastrophic unraveling? The truth is, no single disaster can explain it. Instead, it was a perfect storm of crises piling onto one another. Climate records from tree rings and ice cores tell us the region suffered decades of severe drought, withering crops and sparking famine. At the same time, earthquakes shattered cities already strained by overpopulation and political infighting. Then came the Sea Peoples, a shadowy coalition of raiders who swept through coastal settlements like a force of nature. But were they invaders or desperate refugees fleeing their own collapsing homelands? Historians still debate whether they were the cause of the collapse or just another symptom of a world already coming apart at the seams. Here's what often gets overlooked: the collapse didn't just destroy, it created. In the power vacuum left by fallen empires, new players emerged. The Phoenicians, once minor traders, rose to dominate Mediterranean commerce. Smaller city-states experimented with new forms of government, laying groundwork for the classical world. Even writing systems simplified, paving the way for alphabets we still use today. This wasn't just an ending, it was a brutal but necessary reset, clearing the stage for the next act of human history. Perhaps the most haunting lesson of the Bronze Age collapse is how fragile even the greatest civilizations can be. These weren't primitive societies, they had bureaucracies, international diplomacy, even climate records. And yet, when the threads holding them together snapped, their achievements vanished almost overnight. It's a reminder that progress isn't inevitable. Sometimes history doesn't march forward, it stumbles, falls, and has to find its footing all over again. For centuries, Egypt seemed untouchable, a mighty kingdom protected by deserts and the Nile's predictable floods. Then, around 1650 BCE, everything changed. A mysterious group of outsiders stormed in, not as raiders but as conquerors. The Hyksos, whose name literally means rulers of foreign lands, didn't just invade Egypt, they reshaped it from the inside out. What made them so dangerous wasn't just their military might, but the revolutionary weapons they brought with them, the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow. Until then, Egyptian soldiers fought on foot with simple bows and spears. The Hyksos rolled in with lightweight chariots, fast, maneuverable, and devastating on the battlefield. Their composite bows, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, could fire arrows farther and with more force than anything the Egyptians had ever seen. But here's the twist: this humiliation forced Egypt to adapt in ways no one could have predicted. After decades of Hyksos rule, a rebellion erupted from the southern city of Thebes. The Egyptians didn't just drive the Hyksos out, they stole their technology. By the time Pharaoh Ahmose I reclaimed the throne, Egypt had mastered chariot warfare and turned those innovations against their former oppressors. This wasn't just revenge, it was the birth of a military superpower. The new kingdom that followed became Egypt's golden age, expanding its borders further than ever before. What's often forgotten is how the Hyksos, despite being vilified as foreign invaders, left an indelible mark on Egyptian culture. They introduced new musical instruments, advanced bronze working techniques, and even influenced religious practices. Their reign was a brutal lesson in humility, one that forced Egypt to evolve or perish. The irony: the very tools that brought Egypt to its knees became the foundation of its greatest era. Without the Hyksos, there might never have been a Ramses the Great or the colossal temples of Karnak. History's most enduring empires aren't built on unchallenged dominance, they're forged in the fires of adaptation. Deep in the steamy jungles of what's now Mexico, a civilization thrived centuries before the Maya or Aztecs and left behind a mystery that still baffles archaeologists. The Olmec, often called Mesoamerica's mother culture, carved gargantuan stone heads, some weighing over 20 tons, with such precision that their expressions seemed to gaze across millennia. These aren't just artistic feats, they're statements of power. Each head, fashioned from basalt hauled from quarries 50 miles away, likely portrays a specific ruler, their distinct helmets and facial features hinting at individual identities lost to time. But how did a society without metal tools or wheels transport these monoliths through swamps and rivers? And why invest such staggering effort in monuments that, unlike pyramids or temples, served no obvious practical purpose? The answer might lie in what the heads represent: the birth of centralized authority in the Americas. Creating them required more than skilled artisans. It demanded armies of laborers, coordinated logistics, and leaders persuasive enough to command such devotion. The Olmec didn't just carve stone, they carved the blueprint for Mesoamerican civilization. Their influence rippled outward in trade networks stretching from the highlands to the coast, spreading ideas like ritual ball games and the earliest known writing system in the region. Even their art style, those iconic downturned mouths and flattened noses, appears centuries later in Maya and Aztec sculptures. Yet what's most haunting is how little we truly know. The Olmec left no written records, and their cities were swallowed by the jungle until modern excavations. Those colossal heads, some deliberately buried by their own creators, feel like messages in a bottle, whispers of a society that understood their legacy would outlast them. Maybe that's the point. In a world where empires rise and fall, the Olmec bet on stone to endure, and 30 centuries later, their faces still dare us to unravel their secrets. The Mediterranean world had barely begun to recover from Thera's devastation when a new storm appeared on the horizon, one not of fire and ash but of sails and swords. The Sea Peoples emerged from ancient records like phantoms, their origins unclear, their motives even murkier. Egyptian hieroglyphs depict them as a confederation of warriors, their ships bristling with weapons, their attacks relentless. From 1200 to 900 BCE, they struck with terrifying efficiency, toppling the Hittite Empire, sacking cities from Cyprus to Canaan, and nearly breaking Egypt itself under Ramses III. But who were these raiders who left no written accounts of their own, only wreckage in their wake? Some scholars argue they were pirates turned empire breakers, opportunistic marauders capitalizing on a weakened world. Others paint a darker picture: entire nations on the move, displaced by drought and famine, fighting not for plunder but survival. Recent discoveries add weight to this theory. Climate data reveals prolonged droughts across the Mediterranean during this period, turning fertile lands to dust. Starving populations might have banded together, forming a desperate wave crashing against the gates of settled kingdoms. Imagine entire families aboard those ships, not just warriors but craftsmen, children, the elderly, a civilization adrift with nowhere to go but forward. The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy, they forced reinvention. When their raids subsided, the political map had redrawn itself. Smaller, more agile city-states replaced lumbering empires. Trade routes shifted, favoring those who could adapt quickly. Even military tactics evolved, as the old ways of chariot warfare proved useless against these seaborne attackers. Their greatest legacy might be the lesson they taught the ancient world: no power, no matter how grand, is immune to collapse when the tides of history turn. Perhaps what makes the Sea People so haunting is their anonymity. Unlike the Hyksos or the Olmec, they left no monuments, no art, only echoes in the records of those who barely survived them. Were they villains or victims, conquerors or refugees? The truth may lie somewhere in between, lost beneath the waves they once ruled. Their story reminds us that history isn't just written by the victorious sometimes, it's whispered by the shadows that topple them. History often remembers Egypt as the conqueror, the empire that stretched its influence across the ancient world. But in 760 BCE, the tables turned in a way that still reshapes our understanding of African civilizations. The Nubian kings of Kush, from what's now Sudan, didn't just raid Egypt, they took it over, establishing the 25th dynasty and ruling as pharaohs for nearly a century. This wasn't some fleeting power grab. These were sophisticated monarchs who rebuilt temples, revived religious traditions, and even defended Egypt against Assyrian invasions. Yet for centuries, Western scholars downplayed their achievements, dismissing them as foreigners or interlopers. The truth, the Kushites weren't outsiders at all. Their connection to Egypt ran deeper than the Nile itself. For over 1,000 years, Kush had been Egypt's southern neighbor, trading gold, ivory, and ideas. Nubian archers served in Egyptian armies, and Kushite elites adopted many Egyptian customs. But when Egypt fragmented into warring states, the Kushite king Pi saw an opportunity. His campaign wasn't just a military conquest, it was framed as a holy mission to restore Mat, the divine order. Pi's victory stela, inscribed with his own words, describes how he refused to destroy cities that surrendered, honoring their temples instead. This wasn't a barbarian horde, it was a calculated takeover by rulers who saw themselves as Egypt's true heirs. The Kushite pharaohs didn't just occupy Egypt, they revitalized it. Taharqa, perhaps the most famous of them all, launched ambitious building projects from Thebes to Memphis, erecting monuments that still stand today. He even battled the Assyrians to a stalemate, buying Egypt precious time. But here's what rarely gets mentioned: the Kushites brought their own innovations too. Their mastery of ironworking, likely learned from African cultures farther south, gave them an edge in weaponry. Their pyramids, though smaller than Egypt's, had steeper angles and unique underground chambers, a blend of traditions that created something entirely new. The real tragedy is how their legacy was erased. Later Egyptian dynasties, eager to reclaim glory, scrubbed Kushite names from records. European archaeologists steeped in racist ideologies couldn't reconcile an advanced Egypt with rulers they deemed primitive. But the evidence speaks for itself. From the black granite statues of Pharaoh Shabaka to the gold-filled tombs of Nuri, the Kushites didn't mimic Egypt, they remade it in their image. Their story shatters the myth that greatness in the ancient world flowed one way from north to south. Sometimes history's most revealing moments come not from the center, but from the margins where the overlooked prove they were always at the heart of the story. While empires rose and fell across Mesopotamia, one king obsessed over something far more enduring than military conquest knowledge. Ashurbanipal, the last great ruler of the Assyrian Empire, didn't just amass territory. He built a treasure trove of clay tablets in the 7th century BCE, creating the world's first systematically organized library in Nineveh. Unlike other conquerors who measured wealth in gold or land, Ashurbanipal boasted of his literacy, a rare skill among kings at the time. His scribes scoured the ancient world, copying texts from Babylonian temples, Sumerian schools, and even private collections. The result, over 30,000 tablets preserving everything from astronomy to medicine, law to literature, a time capsule of Mesopotamian thought that might have vanished forever without his obsession. Among those tablets lay a masterpiece nearly lost to time, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Imagine a story so old it predates Homer's Iliad by over a millennium, yet feels achingly human, a tale of friendship, grief, and the quest for immortality. Without Ashurbanipal's library, we might never have known Gilgamesh's journey or the haunting lines of his lament for Enkidu. Why is my hair matted with mud, and why do I wander the streets in the clothes of a lion? This wasn't just preservation, it was a rescue mission for the soul of a civilization. But here's what's often overlooked: the library wasn't just a storage room. It was a revolution in how knowledge was curated. Tablets were catalogued with labels like "for the king's eyes" or "for public use," organized by subject, and even housed in protective clay jars to prevent damage. Some bore the scribe's note stating which original text they'd copied, creating a chain of custody that rivaled modern archives. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, invaders burned the palace, but the fire ironically baked and preserved the tablets, leaving them buried for archaeologists to uncover 2,000 years later. The real genius of Ashurbanipal's project, he understood that power wasn't just about controlling land. It was about controlling narratives. By gathering Mesopotamian wisdom under one roof, he positioned Assyria as the heir to all that came before. And in a way, he succeeded. When we read Gilgamesh today or study Babylonian star charts, we're seeing the world through Ashurbanipal's eyes, a king who bet on clay to outlast empires. His library reminds us that the greatest conquests aren't always marked by bloodshed. Sometimes they're etched in cuneiform, waiting patiently in the dust for someone to listen. Before the clink of coins echoed through marketplaces, trade in the ancient world was a cumbersome dance of barter livestock for grain, pottery for textiles, each transaction bogged down by the constant haggling over unequal values. Then, in the dusty hills of Lydia around 600 BCE, everything changed. Picture a merchant in Sardis, the Lydian capital, handing over a small, bean-shaped lump of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, stamped with the mark of King Aliats. No scales needed, no debates over whether 3 goats equaled a bronze cauldron. This simple act revolutionized commerce in ways we still feel today. The brilliance of Lydian coins wasn't just in their convenience. They introduced an idea so radical it reshaped societies, standardized value. For the first time, worth wasn't tied to the whim of traders but to an authority. The king's seal guaranteed purity and weight. Suddenly, wealth became portable, impersonal, and most importantly, countable. This shift didn't just ease trade, it birthed concepts like salaries, taxes, and even debt. Soldiers could be paid in coins instead of land or food, governments could collect uniform tributes, and loans could be quantified with precision. The very notion of money, as we understand it, crystallized in these tiny, gleaming discs. But the true ripple effect reached far beyond economics. Coins became tools of propaganda, stamped with symbols of power, lions, gods, royal portraits, spreading a ruler's image further than any herald's voice could carry. They accelerated social mobility, allowing enterprising individuals to amass fortunes unrelated to land or lineage. Even warfare transformed, as mercenaries flocked to whoever could pay in the most reliable currency. The Greek city-states, quick to adopt the technology, minted coins celebrating everything from owls Athens to turtles Aegina, turning commerce into a canvas for civic pride. Yet the most profound change was invisible. Coins demanded trust, a collective agreement that a stamped piece of metal held value beyond its material. This abstract faith in symbols paved the way for banking, credit, and eventually paper money. The Lydians couldn't have imagined their invention would lead to stock markets or cryptocurrencies, but the seed was planted in their workshops. Every time we tap a phone to pay or swipe a card, we're part of a chain that stretches back to those first electrum lumps, proof that sometimes the smallest innovations cast the longest shadows. The dust of empires swirled over the plains of Megiddo in 609 BCE, where a battle unfolded that would dictate the fate of the ancient Near East for centuries. Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt marched north with an army so vast, it reportedly took 3 days for all his troops to pass through a single valley. His target, not just the rebellious kingdom of Judah, but the crumbling remains of Assyria, a dying empire he aimed to prop up against the rising tide of Babylon. What made this clash more than just another war was its timing, a moment when the old world order hung by a thread and every move reshaped the board. King Josiah of Judah, young and fiercely independent, saw Necho's advance as a threat to his hard-won autonomy. Against prophetic warnings, he intercepted the Egyptians at Megiddo, a fortress city guarding the vital Via Maris trade route. The outcome was swift and brutal. Judah's forces, no match for Egypt's seasoned charioteers, collapsed. Josiah fell in battle, some say struck by an arrow, others claim he was dragged from his chariot and executed. His death sent shockwaves through the region, not just as a military defeat, but as a spiritual crisis. Josiah had spent his reign purging Judah of foreign idols and centralizing worship in Jerusalem. Now, with his reforms cut short, the kingdom teetered on the brink of irrelevance, but the real stakes were bigger than Judah. Necho's victory at Megiddo briefly restored Egypt as the dominant power in the Levant, only for history to twist the knife. Just 3 years later, Babylon crushed Egypt at Carchemish, rendering Necho's gains meaningless. The irony: Megiddo became a footnote in Egypt's decline, yet its echoes reverberated in Judah's unraveling. Without Josiah's strong hand, his successors vacillated between rebellion and submission, triggering Babylon's brutal siege of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. The temple burned, the elites were exiled, and the very identity of Judah was forged in this crucible of defeat. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Megiddo is how it birthed a theme that would captivate prophets and poets for millennia: the notion of a final, apocalyptic battle on those same plains. The Hebrew name for the site, Armageddon, later became synonymous with the end of days. From Josiah's doomed stand to Revelation's symbolic war, Megiddo reminds us that some battlefields outlive their warriors, becoming mirrors for every generation's deepest fears and hopes. The stones there don't just remember chariots and blood, they whisper about the fragility of power and the weight of choices made in fleeting moments. The open steppe stretched endlessly under the Scythian horses' hooves, a vast sea of grass where these nomadic warriors built an empire without walls or cities. From the 7th to the 3rd century BCE, their influence pulsed across Eurasia, reshaping civilizations from Persia to Greece through two unlikely tools: the composite bow and the golden stag. Unlike the lumbering armies of settled kingdoms, the Scythians fought as they lived, on horseback, striking with lightning speed and vanishing like mist. Their arrows, fired from saddles at full gallop, could pierce armor at 200 paces, a tactic that left even the mighty Persian Empire scrambling to adapt. When Darius the Great invaded Scythian lands, he found no cities to conquer, only scorched earth and hit-and-run raids. The campaign became a humiliating lesson in futility, with the Scythians melting into the horizon, taunting the Persians with gifts of birds, mice, and frogs, symbols of their elusiveness. But the Scythians weren't just destroyers. Their artistry, particularly in gold, reveals a culture of startling sophistication. Tomb excavations unveil intricate pectorals depicting mythical griffins, delicate necklaces with panther motifs, and the iconic golden stag, a masterpiece of dynamic motion, its legs tucked mid-leap as if frozen in time. These weren't mere decorations, they were statements of identity. The stag, with its antlers reaching skyward, symbolized the Scythian connection to the natural world and their shamanistic beliefs. Greek craftsmen in Black Sea colonies often produced these pieces, blending Hellenic techniques with Scythian themes, a cultural dialogue hammered into metal. What's often overlooked is how the Scythians became the ultimate middlemen of the ancient world. Their control of the steppe trade routes, the prehistoric Silk Road, meant Mediterranean wine flowed east to China, while Siberian furs and Central Asian jade moved west. Even their enemies borrowed from them. The Greeks adopted the Scythian-style leather armor and pointed caps, while Persian nobility prized Scythian goldwork. Their legacy lingers in the DNA of modern Eurasian peoples and in the echoes of their warfare, which inspired later cavalry empires like the Mongols. The Scythians remind us that power isn't always measured in stone monuments or written decrees. Sometimes it's etched in the way a golden stag catches the light, or in the whisper of arrows loosed from horseback, a fleeting, fierce presence that left the ancient world forever changed. Long before European explorers set sail for distant shores, a daring Phoenician captain from Carthage launched a voyage that would stretch the boundaries of the known world. Hanno the Navigator, commissioned by his city's senate around 500 BCE, steered 60 ships through the pillars of Hercules' modern Gibraltar and turned south along Africa's unexplored western coast. This wasn't some tentative coastal crawl. His logs describe passing fiery mountains, likely active volcanoes in the Canary Islands, encountering wild men clothed in animal skins, and pushing so far south that the sun blazed from the north at midday, a detail confirming he crossed the equator. The end point of his journey remains debated, but linguistic clues in his account suggest he may have reached Gabon's mangrove forests, nearly 3,000 miles from Carthage. What makes Hanno's expedition extraordinary isn't just the distance, it's the meticulous documentation. Unlike later explorers who mythologized their travels, Hanno left a pragmatic record etched on a temple tablet in Carthage. He noted trading opportunities like ivory and aromatic resins, but also dangers, crocodile-infested rivers, islands echoing with drumbeats at night, and an encounter with hairy people, his interpreters called gorilai, possibly the first written account of gorillas. The Greeks, who later translated his log, dismissed parts as fantasy, yet modern geographers have traced his landmarks with startling accuracy. That volcanic chariot of the gods he described. Likely Mount Kakulima in Guinea, its summit still wreathed in sulphurous fumes. The ripple effects of this voyage reshaped Mediterranean worldviews. Carthage guarded its African trade routes jealously, using Hanno's charts to monopolize commerce in gold, spices, and exotic animals. Meanwhile, Greek thinkers like Herodotus scoffed at tales of a habitable tropics until Pythias of Massalia followed Hanno's example and ventured north to the Arctic. Both expeditions proved the Earth's climatic zones defied classical assumptions. Most intriguing is what might have been lost. Some scholars believe Hanno circumnavigated Africa entirely, a feat not confirmed until the Portuguese millennia later. But when Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, countless records burned, leaving us with only fragments of a journey that dared to go further than anyone thought possible. Hanno's legacy isn't just in miles traveled, it's in the audacity to sail beyond the maps. While his contemporaries clung to coastal waters, he embraced the unknown with a pragmatism that feels strikingly modern. His account contains no sea monsters or fountains of youth, just careful observations of currents, wildlife, and potential trading partners. In that sense, he represents history's quiet turning points, not the clash of empires, but the moment when human curiosity stretched its horizons and never looked back. In the sprawling expanse of the 3rd century BCE, as empires measured their might in conquests and monuments, one ruler dared to think differently, not about how to dominate nature, but how to protect it. Emperor Ashoka of the Mauryan dynasty, whose reign stretched from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal, left behind a legacy far more radical than his military campaigns. Carved into rocks and pillars across the subcontinent, his edicts reveal something astonishing for their time: a legal code that mandated the preservation of forests, the protection of wildlife, and even restrictions on hunting. This wasn't just policy, it was a philosophical revolution etched in stone. Ashoka's transformation came after the brutal Kalinga War, a conflict so bloody it reportedly turned rivers red. The carnage haunted him, leading to his embrace of Buddhism and a radical rethinking of governance. His edicts, written in plain Prakrit rather than the elite Sanskrit, spoke directly to his subjects. One decree ordered the planting of shade trees along roads for travelers and animals. Another prohibited the burning of forests without cause, while a separate ordinance banned the slaughter of certain animals during breeding seasons. Parrots, monkeys, and bats were explicitly listed as protected species, an unprecedented detail in ancient law. But what's often overlooked is how these policies were enforced. Ashoka appointed officers called Dhamma Mahamotras to oversee conservation efforts, effectively creating one of history's first environmental bureaucracies. Along trade routes, wells were dug every half-mile for humans and wildlife alike. Even his famed lion capital pillars, now India's national emblem, carried messages of harmony between humans and nature. The emperor didn't just preach, he institutionalized empathy. The ripple effects were profound. By safeguarding forests, Ashoka ensured sustainable resources for future generations, a stark contrast to the deforestation that crippled later civilizations like Easter Island. His emphasis on nonviolence extended to land use, with edicts urging moderation in logging and agriculture. Some scholars argue this ethos influenced neighboring regions, glimpsed in Sri Lanka's ancient irrigation systems or Southeast Asia's forest monasteries. Yet the true brilliance of Ashoka's vision lies in its recognition of interconnectedness. His edicts didn't separate ecology from economics or spirituality, they wove them together. A healthy forest meant clean water for cities, habitats for pollinators that sustained crops, and shade for soil retention. In an age when most rulers saw nature as something to tame, Ashoka understood it as a web to nurture. His stones still stand today not just as relics but as silent witnesses to a truth we're only now relearning, that empires may rise and fall but the earth endures. And those who listen to it, as Ashoka did, leave footprints deeper than conquest. High in the rugged mountains of Central Asia, where the Hindu Kush meets the Pamir Plateau, a kingdom thrived that defied every expectation. A place where Greek philosophers debated Buddhist monks, where statues of Hercules stood guard over stupas, and where the plays of Euripides were performed under the same skies as Sanskrit sutras. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom, stretching across modern-day Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan from 250 to 130 BCE, wasn't just a remote outpost of Hellenistic culture. It was a dazzling experiment in fusion, proving that the ancient world was far more interconnected than we often assume. This was no accident of geography. After Alexander the Great's empire fractured, his general Diodotus seized control of Bactria, declaring independence from the faltering Seleucid Empire. But unlike other successor states that clung rigidly to Greek traditions, the Greco-Bactrians adapted. Their coins tell the story, silver tetradrachms minted with the profile of King Menander on one side and the Buddhist wheel of Dharma on the other, Greek inscriptions giving way to Prakrit as you flip the coin. Menander himself became a legendary figure in Buddhist texts known as Milinda, who engaged in profound dialogues with the monk Nagasena recorded in the Milinda Panha, a text still studied in monasteries today. Imagine the scene: a Greek king, seated cross-legged, debating reincarnation with a Buddhist sage, their conversation bridging continents of thought. Archaeology paints an even richer picture. At Iconium, a Greco-Bactrian city on the Oxus River, excavations revealed a gymnasium where athletes trained beside Corinthian columned temples, but with Zoroastrian fire altars tucked in their shadows. A theater seating 6,000 hosted performances of Greek tragedies, while nearby workshops produced ivory carvings of Indian deities. The city's layout blended the gridiron plan of Greek urban design with Central Asian courtyard houses, creating a skyline where Mediterranean and Asian architectures weren't just neighbors but collaborators. Yet the kingdom's true legacy lies in its role as a cultural conduit. Greco-Bactrian artists developed the Gandhara style, sculpting the first ever human images of the Buddha, with features strikingly reminiscent of Apollo draped in Greek-style robes. These statues, radiating serene grace, would influence Buddhist art from China to Japan. Even their military innovations echoed far and wide, their heavy cavalry, combining Macedonian tactics with Central Asian horsemanship, may have inspired the knights of later empires. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom didn't just survive at the edge of the known world, it thrived by embracing its position as a crossroads. When nomadic invasions finally toppled it, the echoes of its synthesis lingered. In the deserts of Xinjiang, texts in Greek script praising the Buddha have been found. In Himalayan monasteries, geometric patterns borrowed from Greek mosaics adorned temple floors. This wasn't a clash of civilizations, it was a conversation, one that reminds us that the most enduring cultures aren't those that stand apart, but those that dare to blend. One day in the 6th century CE, the streets of Teotihuacan, the largest city in the pre-Columbian Americas, fell silent. No more crowds gathering at the Pyramid of the Sun, No more merchants haggling in the sprawling marketplaces. No more priests climbing the temple of the feathered serpent to conduct rituals. A metropolis that once housed over 100,000 people, with aqueducts, murals, and apartment complexes rivaling ancient Rome, was abandoned so thoroughly that when the Aztecs stumbled upon its ruins centuries later, they believed gods must have built it. The mystery isn't just why Teotihuacan collapsed, it's how a civilization so advanced could vanish without leaving a single written clue behind. Clues are etched into the bones of the city itself. Archaeologists excavating the ruins found something shocking. The ceremonial heart of Teotihuacan, including the temples along the Avenue of the Dead, had been deliberately burned. Not by accident, but in what appears to be a coordinated act of rebellion. Soot stains on the stonework, collapsed roofs from intense heat, and shattered statues of the city's elite suggest a violent uprising. This wasn't an invasion by outsiders, it was an inside job. For centuries, Teotihuacan had been ruled not by kings, but by a shadowy council of elites who controlled trade, religion, and the military. But by the 6th century, cracks were showing. The apartment compounds, once egalitarian, grew increasingly unequal, with some families hoarding wealth while others crammed into cramped quarters. The stage was set for revolution, yet fire alone doesn't explain the total abandonment. Another piece of the puzzle comes from deep underground speleothems, the mineral deposits in nearby caves that act like ancient rain gauges. Analysis of these formations reveals a grim pattern. Decades of severe drought right when Teotihuacan's population peaked. The same aqueducts that once funneled water from distant springs suddenly ran dry. Crops withered, reservoirs emptied, and a city dependent on maize for survival faced starvation. Some researchers argue this environmental catastrophe triggered the revolt-hungry citizens turning on their leaders when rituals and promises failed to bring rain. But there's a third, haunting possibility lurking in the ruins: disease. Mass graves uncovered near the city outskirts contain skeletons bearing traces of malnutrition and infection. A population already weakened by famine might have succumbed to epidemics, perhaps brought by traders along Teotihuacan's vast commercial networks. Imagine a society collapsing under multiple blows: drought sparking famine, famine fueling unrest, unrest inviting chaos, and chaos leaving survivors no choice but to scatter. What makes Teotihuacan's fate so unsettling is how it mirrors our own vulnerabilities. This wasn't some primitive settlement felled by a single disaster. It was a sophisticated urban center that weathered centuries of challenges until one too many pressures snapped the system. The eerie silence of its ruins whispers a warning. Even the mightiest civilizations are fragile when nature, inequality, and chance conspire. And perhaps that's why the Aztecs, gazing at those towering pyramids, assumed only gods could have built them, because no mere mortals, they thought, could walk away from such grandeur. Unless they had no other choice. Rising from the Ethiopian highlands like stone sentinels, the obelisks of Axum tell a silent but staggering story, one that forces us to rethink Africa's place in the ancient world. In the 4th century CE, while Rome grappled with decline and Persia flexed its imperial might, the kingdom of Axum erected these towering granite spires, some reaching over 100 feet, taller than a 10-story building. But these weren't just monuments, they were statements. Each carefully carved stele mirrored the multi-story houses of Axum's elite, complete with false doors, intricate window designs, and even metal plaques that once caught the sunlight like golden beacons. Imagine approaching the capital at dusk, the last rays setting these giants ablaze, a visual declaration that here stood a civilization every bit as sophisticated as its Mediterranean and Middle Eastern counterparts. What's even more astonishing is how they built them. The largest obelisk, now fallen, weighed an estimated 160 tons, more than 2 fully loaded semi-trucks. Without pulleys or cranes, Axumite engineers likely used a combination of ramps, leverage, and sheer manpower to haul these monoliths from quarries miles away. The precision is mind-boggling. Each stone was meticulously shaped to interlock with others, resisting earthquakes for centuries. This wasn't brute strength, it was applied mathematics and physics on a grand scale. But the obelisk's true power lies in what they represent, Axum's role as a global player. Coins minted here have been found as far away as India, bearing inscriptions in Greek and Ge'ez, the local script. Their rulers, like King Azana, left trilingual edicts carved in Sabaean, Ge'ez, and Greek proclaiming conquests from the Nile to Arabia, one pivotal moment often overshadowed by the stones themselves. Azana's conversion to Christianity in the 300s, making Axum one of the earliest Christian kingdoms, decades before Rome embraced the faith. A surviving obelisk base even shows a cross superimposed over a crescent moon, a symbolic eclipse of pagan beliefs. The tragedy is how little recognition Axum receives in broader narratives. While tourists flock to Egypt's pyramids or Rome's Colosseum, these stelae stand as silent witnesses to a civilization that mastered ocean trade, minted its own currency, and even inspired the legend of the Queen of Sheba. Their influence stretched across the Red Sea to Yemen, where Axumite armies once campaigned, and southward along the Nile, where their gold and ivory fueled Mediterranean markets. The largest obelisk's removal by Mussolini in 1937, a colonial trophy hauled to Rome, only underscores how modern empires still failed to grasp Axum's true significance. Perhaps the most poignant detail is what lies beneath the obelisk's vast underground tombs. Recent excavations reveal burial chambers stocked with everything from delicate glassware imported from Alexandria to ceremonial thrones inlaid with bronze. These weren't just graves, they were portals to the afterlife, stocked for a journey the Axumites believed mirrored their earthly prestige. Today, one obelisk has been repatriated from Italy, a belated acknowledgement of a legacy too long ignored. These stones don't just mark graves, they mark the spot where Africa's narrative intersects with the world's, demanding we listen to their untold story. The grasslands of Central Asia trembled under the hooves of a new kind of horsemen warriors who lived in the saddle, who drank mare's milk mixed with blood, and whose very name would become synonymous with terror in the Roman world, the Huns. But their greatest impact on history wasn't just what they destroyed, it was the domino effect they set in motion. As these nomadic riders surged westward in the 4th century CE, they didn't just cross into Europe, they shoved entire civilizations out of their way, sending shockwaves that would crack the foundations of Rome itself. Picture the scene: Germanic tribes like the Goths, who had lived relatively peacefully along Rome's borders for generations, suddenly found themselves caught between the Huns' advancing hordes and the empire's fortified frontiers. The Gothic refugees, desperate and armed, begged Rome for sanctuary, but when corrupt Roman officials exploited them, selling them dog meat for gold and even taking children as slaves, the Goths revolted. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, their cavalry crushed the Roman legions, killing Emperor Valens and proving for the first time that barbarians could defeat the empire's finest. This wasn't just a military loss, it was a psychological earthquake. The Goths didn't vanish after their victory, they settled within imperial borders, carving out kingdoms inside Rome's own territory. Meanwhile, the Huns themselves, under the infamous Attila, became the ultimate mercenaries of chaos. They didn't just fight, they extorted. For years, Constantinople and Rome paid them staggering sums in gold to attack each other's enemies, effectively outsourcing their wars. Attila played both sides masterfully, once demanding 6,000 pounds of gold from the Eastern Empire, equivalent to hundreds of millions today, just to stop raiding. But when the payments stopped, the Huns turned west, invading Gaul in 451. Though they were halted at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains by a rare alliance of Romans and Germanic tribes, the damage was done. The fragile balance of power had shattered. The true legacy of the Hunnic migration lies in what it unleashed. As their empire collapsed after Attila's death in 453, the Germanic tribes they'd once displaced were now emboldened. Vandals sacked Rome itself in 455. The Ostrogoths established a kingdom in Italy. The Franks rose in Gaul. Rome's western half didn't fall in a single battle. It crumbled under the weight of these decentralized blows, each traceable back to that initial Hunnic push. What's often forgotten is how much the Huns changed Europe's genetic and cultural landscape. Their advanced composite bows and horse archer tactics influenced medieval warfare for centuries. Even their language left traces. Modern Hungarian, though unrelated, proudly claims Hunnic heritage. They were more than mindless destroyers. They were the spark that lit the fuse of the medieval world. When we talk about the fall of Rome, we're really talking about a transformation, one set in motion by riders from the steppe who never intended to build an empire, only to watch the old one burn. While Europe stumbled through its so-called Dark Ages, a revolution was unfolding under the monsoons of India, one that would quietly shape the modern world's understanding of numbers, stars, and healing. The Gupta Empire, stretching across northern India from the 4th to 6th centuries CE, wasn't just a political powerhouse. It was a crucible for ideas so advanced they still echo in our smartphones and satellites today. At its heart stood mathematicians like Aryabhatta, who dared to ask, what if nothing, absolutely nothing, could be something? Picture a scholar in Nalanda, the empire's great university, scratching a tiny dot onto a palm leaf manuscript. That simple mark, called shunya, meaning void, would evolve into the concept of zero, not just as a placeholder, but as a number with its own properties. This wasn't just philosophical musing, it was practical genius. Without zero, calculus, binary code, and even your digital clock would be impossible. Aryabhatta didn't stop there. His calculations of pi 3.1416, remarkably close to today's value, and his assertion that the Earth rotated on its axis, not the sun moving around us, were radical for their time. His astronomical treatise, the Aryabhatiya, describes eclipses and planetary motion with a clarity that would take Europe centuries to match. But the Gupta brilliance extended beyond the stars. In medicine, Sushruta's ancient surgical techniques documented centuries earlier were refined into sophisticated practices. Gupta physicians performed cataract surgeries using curved needles, reconstructed noses with skin grafts, a technique still called the Indian method, and even prescribed antiseptics like turmeric and alcohol for wounds. Their texts describe over 100 surgical instruments, including scalpels, forceps, and speculums, tools that wouldn't look out of place in a modern operating room. What's often overlooked is how these innovations were democratized. Unlike the secretive alchemists of Europe or the cloistered scholars of Alexandria, Gupta knowledge spread through bustling trade routes. Arabic merchants carried Indian numerals westward, hence their misnomer as Arabic numerals, while Buddhist monks transported medical texts along the Silk Road. Even the empire's decline couldn't erase its intellectual footprint. Gupta-era decimal system charts have been found as far away as Cambodia's Angkor temples. The real lesson of the Gupta Golden Age isn't just about past glory. It's about how interconnected knowledge thrives. Their advancements in metallurgy, like the corrosion-resistant iron pillar of Delhi, and urban planning with sewage systems rivaling Rome's, emerged from a culture that valued both spirituality and empirical observation. In an era when most civilizations saw science and religion as opposing forces, Gupta scholars wove them together, seeing the cosmos as a puzzle to be solved through both prayer and precision. That legacy lingers every time we send a probe into space or code a new app, proof that some ideas, like zero itself, may spring from emptiness but fill the world with infinite possibilities. The silk trade in the 6th century wasn't just about luxury, it was about power. Persia controlled every strand of this coveted fabric, moving along the Silk Road, taxing Byzantine merchants into oblivion. Emperor Justinian I had enough. But how do you break a monopoly when the secret silkworms themselves was guarded as fiercely as any imperial treasure? Enter two unnamed monks, history's most unlikely spies, who hatched a plan so audacious it would rewrite the economic map of the Mediterranean. Disguised as Christian missionaries traveling east, these monks reached China's silk heartland, where mulberry trees stretched for miles and silkworms spun their golden cocoons under heavy guard. What happened next sounds like a heist novel. They hollowed out their bamboo walking staffs, carefully packed them with live silkworm eggs, and smuggled them past border patrols under the guise of religious pilgrims. The journey back to Constantinople took years through deserts, mountains, and Persian checkpoints, but when those eggs finally hatched in Byzantine hands, everything changed. The real brilliance wasn't just the theft, but what came after. Justinian-ordered state-sponsored silk farms established across the empire from Syria to Greece. Byzantine weavers, already masters of textile arts, experimented wildly, blending Chinese techniques with Mediterranean dyes to create shimmering patterns that soon outpaced Persian quality. By 552, Constantinople's workshops were producing enough silk to undercut Persian prices while keeping the finest pieces for imperial diplomacy. A single bolt could buy alliances with Frankish kings or appease restless barbarian chieftains. What's often overlooked is how this industrial espionage shifted geopolitics. Persia's treasury, heavily reliant on silk taxes, took a devastating hit. Meanwhile, Byzantine silk became a currency of its own, used to bribe avars during sieges, ransom captured soldiers, and even fund the construction of Hagia Sophia's dome. The schism between East and West deepened as Rome's bishops clamored for access to these exclusive fabrics, yet the monks' legacy extended beyond economics. Their silkworms sparked Europe's first biotechnology boom. Byzantine scientists selectively bred strains for thicker threads, documented temperature's effect on cocoon quality, and even developed early quarantine protocols to prevent disease outbreaks in worm colonies. When Arab armies later captured Byzantine silk workers during their conquests, these techniques spread through the Islamic world, eventually reaching Sicily and Spain. The irony: China's carefully guarded secret had been stolen before Korean monks reportedly smuggled silkworms centuries earlier in their own hollowed-out canes. But the Byzantine success proved something radical. That knowledge, no matter how closely held, couldn't be contained forever. In an age before patents or copyrights, the monks' daring theft reshaped empires by reminding us that the most valuable treasures aren't gold or jewels. They're the living, spinning, endlessly replicable ideas hiding in plain sight. In the misty islands of 7th century Japan, power was a fragmented thing split among warring clans, each ruling their own lands with little regard for the distant emperor in Asuka. That all changed in 645 CE with a single, bloody night that would reshape the nation forever. The Ishi incident, a carefully plotted coup, saw Prince Naka-no-o and his ally Nakatomi no Kamatari ambush and murder the powerful Soga clan leader in the very palace courtyard. But this wasn't just about revenge, it was the spark for Japan's most radical transformation, the Taika reforms. Inspired by the towering achievements of Tang China, these edicts didn't just tweak the system, they tore it down and rebuilt it from scratch. At the heart of the reforms was a simple but revolutionary idea. Land doesn't belong to the clans, it belongs to the state. Overnight, private estates were declared imperial property, with officials dispatched to survey every rice paddy and forest. Taxes, once paid to local lords, now flowed directly to the capital. The old hereditary titles, replaced by a Chinese-style meritocracy where bureaucrats earned posts through exams, not birthright. Even the calendar was overhauled to mirror the Tang system, syncing Japan's rhythms with what they saw as the pinnacle of civilization. What's often overlooked is how thoroughly these changes rewired Japanese society. The reforms introduced China's equal field system, redistributing farmland to peasants every few years to prevent wealthy elites from monopolizing territory. A census recorded every citizen's age, gender, and skills, an early form of state surveillance that doubled as a military draft tool. the capital itself moved from Asuka to Naniwa, modern Osaka, designed on a grid plan mimicking Chang'an, the Tang capital. But the Taika reforms weren't just about copying China. They were about survival. Envoys returning from the continent had seen Tang armies crushing neighboring states with terrifying efficiency. A fragmented Japan, they realized, stood no chance against such a force. Centralization wasn't just political, it was existential. The emperor, once a symbolic figurehead, now sat at the helm of a true nation-state, with Kamatari's newly created Fujiwara clan as its bureaucratic engine. The genius of the reforms lay in their flexibility. While adopting Chinese models, Japan adapted them to local needs, keeping the indigenous Shinto religion alongside imported Buddhist practices, for example. This cultural nimbleness would define Japan for centuries, absorbing foreign ideas while preserving its own identity. By the time the reforms were codified in the Teiho Code of 701, Japan had leapfrogged from a patchwork of tribes to a state capable of facing continental powers as equals. Yet the Taika reforms' legacy isn't just in laws or land deeds, it's in the very idea of Japan as a unified nation. Without this 7th century revolution, there might never have been a samurai class, a shogunate, or even the modern imperial system. Like silkworms smuggled in bamboo, the reforms carried seeds of change that grew into something wholly new, proof that sometimes reinvention isn't just progress. It's destiny. High on the Tibetan plateau, where the winds whip through the Hexi corridor, a kingdom rose with ambitions as towering as the Himalayas, the Western Xia. By the 11th century, this Tangut state had carved out an empire straddling the Silk Road, a crossroads of cultures where Chinese, Tibetan, and Central Asian influences collided. But their most audacious act wasn't conquest or commerce. It was the creation of an entirely new writing system from scratch, a script so complex it would take 700 years for modern scholars to crack its code. Emperor Lai Yuanhao, the Western Xia's founding ruler, understood something profound. To stand among the great civilizations of his time, his people needed more than armies. They needed a language of their own. In 1036, he ordered his chief scholar, Yeli Renrong, to design a script that could capture the Tangut tongue. The result was staggering. 6,000 distinct characters, each more intricate than Chinese Hanzi, with swooping strokes that resembled Tibetan calligraphy, fused with the angular precision of seal scripts. To the untrained eye, they looked like abstract art, loops, dots, and slashes arranged with deliberate asymmetry. But this was no vanity project. The script became the empire's administrative backbone, chiseled into stone stelae, inked onto Buddhist sutras, even stamped onto coins proclaiming the dynasty's sovereignty. What's often forgotten is how radical this linguistic rebellion truly was. At a time when Chinese writing dominated East Asia's bureaucracy, the Tangut script sent a clear message: the Western Xia would bow to no cultural hegemony. Buddhist monks translated vast canons into Tangut, creating parallel texts where Sanskrit wisdom met steppe pragmatism. Official documents, from tax records to marriage contracts, were penned in these elegant characters, binding the empire together through shared symbols. Even more remarkably, the script was taught systematically. Archaeologists have found practice tablets where students copied characters line by line, their ink strokes betraying the same frustration any language learner feels today. The tragedy lies in how thoroughly this linguistic achievement was nearly erased. When Genghis Khan's armies besieged the Western Xia in the 1220s, their vengeance was total. The Mongols didn't just topple cities, they systematically dismantled Tangut identity. Libraries burned, stelae were toppled, scholars were slaughtered or scattered. For centuries, the script survived only in a few hidden caves like those at Dunhuang, where monks had sealed away manuscripts in desperation. By the time European explorers stumbled upon these texts in the early 20th century, no living soul could read them. Deciphering the Tangut script became one of linguistics' greatest detective stories. Soviet scholar Nikolai Nevsky made the first breakthroughs in the 1930s, comparing bilingual Buddhist texts character by character. But the real key lay in a single glossary, the Pearl in the Palm, a Tangut Chinese dictionary painstakingly reconstructed from fragments. Today, nearly 90% of the script's characters have been decoded, revealing a lost world where poetry, legal codes, and even military manuals once thrived. The Tangut script's legacy isn't just in its characters, it's in the defiant act of creation itself. In a world where empires often imposed their languages by force, the Western Zia dared to say, "Our words matter." That they were silenced only makes their voice, now rising from the ashes, all the more vital. Every stroke of their writing whispers the same truth, that history belongs not just to the conquerors, but to those who dared to write their own story. While medieval Europe built castles and cathedrals, the Khmer Empire engineered something far more revolutionary, a hydraulic metropolis where water flowed with precision through the jungles of Cambodia. At its peak in the 12th century, Angkor wasn't just a city, it was a living machine sustained by an intricate network of canals, reservoirs, and moats that turned seasonal monsoons into a life-giving pulse. The crown jewel of this system was the West Barre, a man-made reservoir stretching 5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide, holding over 50 million cubic meters of water. To put that in perspective, it could fill 20,000 Olympic swimming pools, but this wasn't just about storage, it was about control. The Khmer didn't fight nature, they orchestrated it. Their engineers designed a grid of channels that redistributed floodwaters during the monsoon, then released them slowly during dry months, ensuring rice paddies never thirsted. Temple inscriptions detail teams of workers called Num, who maintained sluice gates and dredged silt with almost religious devotion. Even Angkor Wat's moat wasn't merely defensive, it acted as a stabilizing reservoir, its water levels calibrated to prevent underground erosion of the temple's foundations. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was a philosophy. The Khmer saw water as sacred, their reservoirs mirroring the mythical Himalayan lakes of Hindu cosmology. Yet the system's true genius lay in its adaptability. LiDAR scans reveal how neighborhoods were elevated on mounds, avoiding floods while wastewater filtered through sand pits, an ancient precursor to modern sanitation. Fish thrived in the channels, providing protein, while floating villages on Tonle Sap Lake became trading hubs linked to Angkor's canals. The empire didn't just survive the monsoon cycle, it thrived, supporting up to 1 million people when London was a cramped town of 20,000. The tragedy is how this mastery became their undoing. Recent studies of tree rings showed decades of droughts in the 14th century, followed by extreme monsoons that overwhelmed the system. Canals silted up without maintenance during crises, while deforestation for expanding rice fields disrupted natural water tables. The final blow may have been geopolitical Siamese raids targeting the hydraulic network's key nodes. A civilization that tamed water for centuries ultimately fell when the balance slipped from its grasp. What lingers today isn't just the ghostly beauty of temple ruins, but a lesson in sustainable urbanism. Angkor's engineers understood something we're only now relearning, that cities aren't separate from their ecosystems, but extensions of them. The sandstone gods still standing guard at Angkor Wat aren't just monuments to kings, they're silent witnesses to a truth etched in the land itself. Civilizations rise and fall, but the water always finds its way. In 1324, a king set out on a journey that would rewrite the map of global wealth not through conquest but through charity. Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, embarked on a Hajj to Mecca with a caravan so vast it strained the imagination. Contemporary accounts describe 60,000 travelers, 12,000 slaves clad in Persian silk, and 80 camels laden not with supplies but pure gold dust, each beast carrying 300 pounds of it. This wasn't just a pilgrimage, it was a mobile declaration of Mali's staggering prosperity, a spectacle that would ripple through economies from Cairo to Venice. The moment Mansa Musa entered Cairo, the city's economy shuddered. He distributed so much gold to the poor and to dignitaries that the metal's value plummeted overnight. Egyptian scribes recorded the price of gold dropping by 20% and taking over a decade to recover. Imagine the scene: nobles suddenly finding their fortunes diluted, merchants struggling to adjust prices, and Cairo's markets flooded with so much West African gold that it became momentarily worthless. This wasn't generosity, it was an unintentional act of economic warfare, exposing how fragile medieval financial systems really were. But the real story isn't just about gold, it's about perception. Until Mansa Musa's Hajj, Europe had only vague notions of Africa's wealth. Catalan cartographers rushed to update their maps, suddenly depicting Mali as a land of golden cities. The empire's capital, Timbuktu, became legendary overnight, drawing scholars, traders, and adventurers eager to glimpse its riches. Musa himself commissioned the Great Mosque of Timbuktu upon his return, staffing it with Andalusian architects and filling its libraries with texts from across the Islamic world. The pilgrimage didn't just spread gold, it spread knowledge, transforming Timbuktu into an intellectual hub that would outlast the empire itself. What's often overlooked is how calculated this display of wealth really was. Musa didn't just stumble into disrupting economies, he understood the power of spectacle. By showcasing Mali's resources, he secured trade agreements with North African sultans and positioned his empire as the dominant force in trans-Saharan commerce. The gold he gave away was a strategic investment, buying influence that would funnel even more wealth back to Mali. His Hajj wasn't just a religious duty, it was the medieval equivalent of a corporate takeover, executed with deliberate flair. The aftermath reveals an ironic twist. While Mansa Musa's spending spree briefly destabilized regions, it also integrated West Africa into global trade networks like never before. Venetian merchants, desperate to replenish their gold reserves after the Cairo crash, began sending expeditions down the Niger River. The very act of devaluing gold inadvertently bound Europe and Africa closer together, setting the stage for centuries of exchange and eventual exploitation. The pilgrimage legacy isn't just in the gold dust left in its wake, but in the uncomfortable truth it exposes. That generosity and power are often two sides of the same coin, spinning through history with unpredictable consequences. High on the savanna of southern Africa, where the Limpopo River winds through granite hills, a city rose from stone not with mortar but with sheer precision. Great Zimbabwe's towering walls, some 30 feet high and 16 feet thick, weren't just fortifications, they were billboards advertising wealth. From the 11th to 15th centuries, this kingdom became the hub of a trade network so vast it stretched from the interior goldfields to the Swahili coast and beyond, connecting African miners with merchants as far away as China and Persia. The lifeblood of this empire wasn't conquest, it was commerce. Zimbabwe's rulers controlled the gold-rich plateau between the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers, where miners extracted nuggets from shallow pits and alluvial deposits. But here's what set them apart. They didn't just trade raw materials. At archaeological sites like Mapungubwe, crucibles and tires, clay pipes used for bellows reveal sophisticated metalworking. Goldsmiths alloyed gold with copper to create a distinctive rose gold hue, casting ingots into standardized bars that became the region's currency. These weren't crude exchanges. They were transactions calibrated down to the gram, with Arab and Swahili merchants recording weights in meticulous ledgers. The scale was staggering. One Portuguese document from the 16th century, based on earlier Swahili accounts, describes great Zimbabwe's rulers receiving a camel load of gold in annual tribute. Excavations at the city's elite enclosures uncovered Persian glass beads, Chinese celadon pottery, and even fragments of Indian cloth, tangible proof of a marketplace where continents converged. The kingdom's wealth wasn't hoarded, it was displayed in architectural feats. The famous conical tower, likely a grain silo, symbolized both surplus and stability, while the stone bird carvings found atop monoliths may have represented trade alliances stretching across the Indian Ocean. But the real genius lay in logistics. Without written records, the kingdom coordinated caravans of porters carrying ivory tusks, gold, and copper ingots over hundreds of miles to coastal entrepots like Sofala. There, Swahili middlemen brokered deals with dhow captains who sailed monsoons to Zanzibar and beyond. In return, luxury goods flowed inland, silks for royalty, spices for rituals, and crucially cowrie shells from the Maldives, which became a standardized currency across Africa. This wasn't a one-sided exchange. Zimbabwean traders dictated terms, often insisting on cloth over coins, knowing textiles held more stable value in their markets. What's often overlooked is how this trade reshaped societies far beyond Africa. Zimbabwean gold fueled economies from Cairo to Venice, filling the coffers of Mamluk sultans and Venetian ducats alike. Some historians argue the kingdom's decline in the 15th century, possibly due to deforestation or shifting trade routes, contributed to Europe's desperate search for new gold sources, indirectly sparking the age of exploration. The stones of Great Zimbabwe still whisper secrets. Recent LiDAR scans reveal an urban sprawl supporting up to 18,000 people, with terraced farms and reservoirs sustaining a population denser than medieval London. Yet for centuries, European colonizers refused to believe Africans could build such a metropolis, attributing it to mythical Phoenicians or King Solomon. The truth etched in those mortarless walls is far more powerful. A civilization that mastered economics without ledgers, diplomacy without treaties, and architecture without blueprints, proving that some empires rise not by the sword, but by the weight of gold and the wit to wield it wisely. The sands of Peru's northern coast hold a chilling secret, one that reveals how climate disaster can warp even the most sacred human instincts. In the mid-15th century, as the Chimu Empire neared its peak, workers at Huanchaquito, Los Llamas made a grisly discovery. Beneath layers of wind-blown dirt lay the largest mass child sacrifice site ever uncovered in the Americas. The remains of over 140 children and 200 juvenile llamas, their ribs splayed open in precise cuts, their bodies arranged in eerie rows facing the Pacific. This wasn't random violence, it was a ritual of desperation, frozen in time by the same forces that may have driven the Chimu to such extremes, a catastrophic El Niño event. Forensic evidence paints a harrowing picture. The children, mostly between 5 and 14 years old, show signs of being well fed before death, suggesting they were selected from across society rather than taken from the poorest families. Analysis of their teeth reveals periods of severe malnutrition earlier in life, clues pointing to recurring food shortages, but the real smoking gun lies in the sediment. Layers of thick, wet mud-preserved sandal prints and hoof marks, indicating the sacrifices coincided with sudden, torrential rains in this arid region. For a civilization dependent on precise irrigation from fragile rivers, and El Niño's chaotic downpours would have been apocalyptic, canals overflowing, crops drowning, seawater poisoning freshwater supplies. What's often overlooked is how calculated this offering was. The children's chests were cut open in near-identical patterns, their hearts likely removed as gifts to the gods. The llamas, always brown-furred and under 18 months old, were placed in specific cardinal directions. This level of orchestration suggests the Chimu weren't acting in panic, but following a grim protocol, perhaps drawing on centuries-old traditions reserved for existential threats. Spanish chronicles later mentioned Inca legends of similar sacrifices during catastrophes, hinting at a shared Andean belief that only the most innocent lives could rebalance nature's fury. The broader context makes this event even more poignant. The Chimu were master hydrologists, their capital Chan Chan laced with intricate aqueducts feeding vast agricultural fields. Their empire thrived by controlling water in one of Earth's driest deserts. When El Niño turned their life-giving systems against them, they turned to the only leverage they believed could appease the gods, their future. Within decades, the Chimu fell to the Inca, leaving these buried pleas as mute witnesses to a civilization pushed to the edge by a warming Pacific. Today, as we face our own climate crises, Huayna Chiquito's bones whisper an uncomfortable question. When survival hangs in the balance, what lines would any society cross? High in the Andes, where the thin air carries whispers of a lost empire, the Inca built an administrative marvel without a single written word. Instead, they wove their records into intricate knotted cords called quippus, a system so sophisticated it could track census data, tax obligations, and even historical narratives through nothing but strings and knots. Imagine an entire civilization running on what looks like a collection of tangled yarn, yet containing the same bureaucratic precision as a modern spreadsheet. Each quipu began with a primary cord from which hung dozens of subsidiary strings in vibrant colors. The position, type, and number of knots conveyed specific information, a concept similar to binary code centuries before computers. A single knot at the top might represent 100, while clusters further down could denote tens or units. Colors weren't just decorative, they were categorical. Red strings might record military units, yellow for gold tributes, green for agricultural yields. Some scholars believe the spinner's choice of fiber, llama, alpaca, or vicuña wool, even indicated geographic origins of the data. This wasn't just accounting, it was a three-dimensional language of empire, but here's where it gets fascinating. Recent studies suggest quippus may have encoded narratives too. One startling discovery in Peru revealed a quipu buried with a Spanish-era manuscript, a land deed. The knots aligned precisely with the document's numerical details, hinting that quippus could cross-reference written records. Even more compelling are the accounts of indigenous historians like Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, who claimed certain quippus held songs and treaties. If true, these knots weren't just calculators, they were libraries. The system's brilliance lay in its portability and security. Unlike parchment, quippus didn't rot in the humid jungle or crumble in desert tombs. Inca bureaucrats called quipucamayocs could carry entire ledgers across treacherous mountain passes, updating them in real time as goods moved through the empire's storehouses. And because only trained specialists could read them, they functioned as a form of encrypted communication, a pre-Columbian blockchain. What remains haunting is how much we've lost. Spanish chroniclers, baffled by the cords, dismissed them as pagan artifacts. Thousands were burned in the 16th century, severing a data pipeline that had sustained 10 million people. Today, fewer than 1,000 survive, their meanings half guessed at through colonial documents and modern computer algorithms. The irony, the very conquerors who destroyed the quippus relied on indigenous accountants to decipher them for decades, proving that some systems are too vital to erase completely. Perhaps the most poignant lesson of the quipu isn't about the past but the future. In an age drowning in digital data, these tactile knots remind us that information doesn't need screens to be sophisticated. They challenge our assumption that writing is the pinnacle of communication, offering instead a parallel path, one where numbers, stories, and even laws could be felt between the fingers, woven into the very fabric of a culture. The quipu's knots may be silent now, but their potential whispers across centuries that there are always untold ways to remember. Long before Columbus set sail, a ruler made a choice so audacious it still sparks debate 6 centuries later. Mansa Abu Bakr II, emperor of the Mali Empire, reportedly abdicated his throne for the sake of exploration. In 1311, according to Arab historian al-Umari's accounts, Abu Bakr assembled 200 ships stocked with gold, supplies, and skilled sailors, sending them westward into the Atlantic with one command: don't return until you found the ocean's edge. Only one vessel came back, its captain reporting a terrifying encounter with a violent current in the middle of the sea. Rather than accept defeat, Abu Bakr stepped down, personally leading a second, even larger fleet into the unknown, never to be seen again. What makes this story electrifying isn't just its scale. It's the tantalizing possibility that these voyages may have reached the Americas. Portuguese documents from the 1500s describe West African traders in Panama decades before Columbus, while Olmec stone heads in Mexico, dating to over 1,000 years earlier, bear uncanny resemblances to Mande facial features. Even more compelling are linguistic traces. Words like banana and yam entered indigenous Caribbean languages long before European contact, suggesting prior Afro-American exchanges. Yet skeptics counter with valid questions. No physical evidence of Malian ships has surfaced in the Americas, and Al-Umri's account relies on second-hand testimony. But consider this, Mali's sailors weren't novices. They routinely plied the treacherous currents between West Africa and the Canary Islands, using stars and ocean swells to navigate. Their vessels, constructed from tightly bound papyrus or mahogany, mirrored the design of proven transatlantic rafts like those later used by Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki expedition. The real significance lies less in whether Abu Bakr reached Brazil than in what his attempt reveals about medieval Africa's maritime ambitions. At its height, Mali controlled gold mines producing 2/3 of the Old World supply wealth that funded not just mosques and universities but daring voyages of discovery. While Europe clung to coastal trade, a West African emperor bet his throne on the promise of lands beyond the horizon. That vision, whether fulfilled or not, reshapes our understanding of who pioneered exploration and whose stories we've forgotten to tell. The Valley of Mexico in the 10th century was a fractured chessboard of city-states, each vying for dominance in the power vacuum left by Teotihuacan's collapse. Into this chaos rode the Toltecs, part warrior elite, part mythologized dynasty, who claimed descent from the legendary Quetzalcoatl and built their capital at Chala. But their grip on the region faced a relentless challenge from the north. The Chichimca, nomadic tribes dismissed as barbarians by settled societies, yet whose ferocity and adaptability would ultimately redraw the political map of Mesoamerica. What began as sporadic raids escalated into a century of existential warfare. The Toltecs, with their ceremonial ball courts and intricately carved warrior columns, represented urbanized sophistication. The Chichimca, by contrast, fought with guerrilla tactics, using the rugged northern deserts as both shield and sword. Contemporary accounts describe their warriors clad in animal skins, armed with obsidian-tipped spears, descending without warning on Toltec trade caravans. But this wasn't just a clash of weapons, it was a collision of worldviews. The Toltecs saw themselves as civilizers, heirs to Teotihuacan's glory, while the Chichimca embodied the untamed forces of nature, resisting assimilation. The turning point came when drought scorched the valley in the 12th century. As crops failed, Toltec cohesion unraveled. Factions within Chala's elite began defecting to Chichimca warlords, trading allegiance for survival. One such figure, Xolotl, emerged as the architect of a new order. By marrying Chichimca battle prowess with Toltec administrative savvy, he forged a hybrid kingdom that absorbed both cultures. His descendants would rule from Texcoco, blending the nomad's resilience with the city dweller's statecraft, a template the Aztecs later perfected. Archaeology reveals the war's cultural aftershocks. At Chala, sculptures of eagle warriors stand beside crude Chichimca-style arrowheads, evidence of uneasy coexistence. In the Codex Xolotl, painted centuries later, scribes depicted the conflict not as a clean conquest but as a messy synthesis, with intermarriage and shared rituals smoothing the transition. The Toltec-Chichimca wars didn't end with one side annihilating the other, they ended with a new people emerging from the crucible, carrying fragments of both identities forward. What's often overlooked is how this struggle shaped the Aztec rise. When the Mexica entered the valley in the 13th century, they found a political landscape already transformed by the Toltec-Chichimca fusion. They copied Xolotl's playbook, claiming Toltec heritage while recruiting Chichimca mercenaries for their armies. Even the famed Aztec eagle and jaguar warrior orders owed debts to both traditions, one's discipline layered over the other's ferocity. The real lesson of these wars lies in their paradox. The so-called barbarians didn't destroy civilization, they rejuvenated it. Like a forest fire clearing space for new growth, the Chichimca raids toppled a stagnant order, making room for the dynamic societies that followed. Their legacy whispers through the stones of Chila and Tenochtitlan alike, proof that history's most transformative conflicts aren't always won by the side with the grandest temples, but by those who adapt faster to the winds of change. Amid the shifting sands of Central Asia, where empires rose and fell like desert mirages, the Sogdians carved out a legacy not with swords but with contracts and caravans. These merchants from the fertile valleys of modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan became the indispensable middlemen of the ancient world, transforming the Silk Road from a sporadic trade route into a thriving economic artery between the 4th and 8th centuries. While kings and conquerors grabbed headlines, it was the Sogdians who kept goods and ideas flowing across continents. Their secret wasn't just mobility, it was cultural fluency. Sogdian traders mastered multiple languages from Sanskrit to Persian, and even developed their own script adapted from Aramaic. Archaeological finds from China's Tarim Basin reveal Sogdian letters etched on wooden slips, filled with transactions, marriage arrangements, and heartbreaking pleas from homesick traders. One particularly poignant note from a merchant named Nanai Vandak to his family reads, "I am very ill, and if the gods will it, I may see you again alive." These weren't faceless middlemen, they were fathers, sons, and husbands risking everything in pursuit of profit and connection. The goods they transported read like a manifesto of globalization's first draft. Chinese silk flowed west to clothe Persian nobility, while Persian silver coins traveled east to fuel Tang dynasty economies. But the Sogdians traded more than material wealth, they were conduits for culture. Buddhist sutras moved along their routes, translated from Sanskrit into Sogdian and then Chinese. Nestorian Christian crosses and Zoroastrian fire altars appeared in their settlements, evidence of a religious tolerance rare for the era. Even technology hitchhiked on their caravans. Chinese paper-making techniques reached Samarkand by the 8th century, where Sogdian craftsmen perfected the process, eventually passing it to the Islamic world and Europe. What set the Sogdians apart was their knack for turning geography into opportunity. Their heartland sat at the crossroads of the Silk Road's northern and southern routes, allowing them to control access to both China's markets and Persia's workshops. They built thriving city-states like Panjshir and Afrasiab, where frescoes depict envoys from as far as Korea and Byzantium mingling in bustling marketplaces. Their homes, excavated by archaeologists, reveal an almost modern cosmopolitanism, wall murals showing banquets with Indian musicians, Chinese dancers, and Persian poets sharing wine under grape arbors. The real testament to their influence lies in the Tang dynasty's reaction. By the 7th century, Sogdian merchants dominated China's western markets so thoroughly that the Tang court appointed them as official border administrators. Sogdian musicians played in imperial orchestras, their swirling dances and harp like congas enchanting Chinese elites. Even their fashion became trendy. Tang aristocrats adopted Sogdian-style round-collared robes and peaked hats, while their love of grape wine fueled a craze for Central Asian vineyards. Yet their golden age couldn't last forever. The Arab conquests of the 8th century shattered their networks, Islamizing the region and diverting trade to Baghdad's control. Many Sogdians assimilated into Persian or Turkic cultures, their language fading like a desert caravan's footprints. But their legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern Uzbek surnames ending in "av" trace back to Sogdian patronymics, while the very word paradise comes from their Persian-influenced concept of walled gardens. The Sogdians remind us that history's most enduring changes often come not from battlefields but from bazaars. They built no great empires, left no colossal monuments, just countless threads of connection woven across continents. In an age of walls and divisions, their story whispers an alternative, a world where profit and mutual interest could bridge even the widest cultural divides, where a merchant ledger might prove more powerful than a king's decree. High in the sandstone cliffs of the American Southwest, the Anasazi, or ancestral pueblones, built entire cities tucked into rocky alcoves, their multi-story dwellings clinging to canyon walls like swallows' nests. By the 12th century, Mesa Verde's cliff palaces reached their zenith, with structures like Cliff House boasting over 150 rooms and 23 kivas, circular ceremonial chambers, sunk into the earth. Then, within a generation, the residents vanished, leaving behind pottery, tools, and even meals half-eaten. The question isn't just why they left, but why they retreated into these precarious heights in the first place, and what finally drove them out. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, reveals a grim backdrop, a 70-year megadrought gripping the region from 1130 to 1190. Juniper and pinyon pine samples show stunted growth, signaling years when rain barely moistened the soil. For a people dependent on maize, beans, and squash, this wasn't just hardship, it was existential. The very design of their cliff dwellings hints at desperation. Built in shadowed recesses, these structures collected precious dew runoff from the canyon walls, while their south-facing orientation minimized sun exposure, reducing water loss. Even their signature T-shaped doorways, once thought purely ceremonial, may have helped conserve heat during freezing winters. Yet drought alone doesn't explain the violence etched into the archaeological record. At Cowboy Wash in southwestern Colorado, researchers uncovered 7 skeletons in a pit dwelling victims of blunt force trauma and dismemberment. Pottery shards nearby showed signs of killing, deliberate punctures or smashings, possibly ritualized destruction during conflict. Across the region, similar sites reveal burned kivas and defensive walls hastily erected on mesa tops. The Anasazi weren't just fleeing the weather, they were fleeing each other. Theories abound. Some scholars argue that social stratification evidenced by unequal food storage between dwellings sparked unrest when resources dwindled. Others point to the rise of competing religious movements, as seen in the abrupt shift from round to square kivas, signaling new spiritual hierarchies. One provocative study even suggests cannibalism may have occurred, though this remains fiercely debated. What's clear is that Mesa Verde's final days were marked by both environmental collapse and human discord, a lethal feedback loop. The Anasazi's legacy lies in their adaptation. When they abandoned the cliffs in the late 1200s, they didn't vanish. They migrated south, joining existing Pueblo communities along the Rio Grande. Their descendants, the Hopi, Zuni, and Acoma peoples, still recount oral histories of this exodus, framing it not as defeat but as transformation. The cliff dwellings stand empty now, not as ruins but as relics of resilience, stone diaries of a people who refused to perish, even when the sky withheld its mercy and the earth its peace. At the crossroads of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, where the Red Sea laps at rugged highlands, a kingdom made a choice that would echo through millennia. In the 4th century CE, Aksum's ruler Ezana stood before his court not as a conqueror, but as a man transformed. The coins minted during his reign tell the story. Early issues bear the crescent and disk of the pagan gods, while later ones blaze with the cross. This wasn't just a personal conversion. Aksum became one of the world's first Christian states, decades before Rome embraced the faith under Constantine. What makes this moment extraordinary isn't just its timing, it's the cultural alchemy that followed. Ethiopian tradition holds that 2 shipwrecked Syrian brothers, Frumentius and Edesius, introduced Christianity to Aksum after becoming tutors to the young prince. Frumentius, later ordained as Ethiopia's first bishop by none other than Athanasius of Alexandria, didn't impose foreign practices wholesale. Instead, he wove Christian teachings into local customs. The Ark of the Covenant, revered in Jerusalem, found its mythical new home in Axum's Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. Indigenous Ge'ez liturgy blended with Byzantine chants, creating worship forms unlike anything in Europe or the Middle East. Political ramifications were profound. Ezana's adoption of Christianity wasn't merely spiritual, it was a geopolitical chess move. By aligning with Alexandria's Coptic Church rather than Rome or Constantinople, Axum secured trade alliances with Byzantine Egypt while distinguishing itself from Persia's Zoroastrian sphere. Christian imagery became diplomatic shorthand. When Ezana sent envoys to Constantinople, their gifts included jeweled crosses that dazzled the imperial court. The kingdom's stone obelisks, once monuments to royal power, now bore inscriptions invoking the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, in both Greek and Ge'ez, a bilingual declaration of divine legitimacy. Archaeology reveals how deeply Christianity permeated daily life. At Adulis, Axum's bustling Red Sea port, workers' quarters contained ceramic oil lamps stamped with crosses alongside traditional pagan motifs, evidence of gradual, organic adoption rather than forced conversion. The famous Stele field shows a fascinating transition. Earlier, phallic-shaped monuments give way to slab-like ones resembling the tablets of Moses. Even military campaigns took on new symbolism. Ezana's victory stela over the Nubian kingdom of Mara credits his triumph not to the war god Maram, but to the Lord of Heaven. The lasting impact defies exaggeration. While European Christianity fractured into Catholic and Protestant factions, Ethiopia's church maintained unbroken traditions, including practices long abandoned elsewhere, like Sabbath observance on Saturday. The Garima Gospels, illuminated manuscripts dating from Axum's Golden Age, remain the world's oldest complete Christian texts, their vivid colors miraculously preserved in highland monasteries. When Islam swept across North Africa in the 7th century, Axum's status as Christianity's African cradle allowed it to negotiate unique protections. The Prophet Muhammad himself reportedly granted Ethiopia's Christians asylum, a debt owed to Axum's earlier sheltering of Muslim refugees. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in what didn't happen. While Europe plunged into doctrinal wars, Axum's Christianity absorbed rather than erased. The ancient festival of Maskell, originally a pagan celebration of the seasonal rains, became a Christian holiday commemorating the discovery of the true cross. The demon-slaying warrior saints of Ethiopian iconography mirror pre-Christian protective spirits. This wasn't conversion as conquest, it was faith as fusion, proving that the world's most enduring belief systems aren't those that reject the past, but those that find divine sparks already flickering in human hearts. History isn't made by grand gestures alone. It's shaped in the margins, in the quiet moments few thought to record. These 30 forgotten events show us how a single volcanic eruption rewrote trade routes, how a child's sacrifice under a storm-darkened sky could alter an empire's fate, and how a merchant's stolen silkworms unraveled a monopoly that had held for centuries. Each one is a ripple that became a tidal wave, proving that the threads of human progress are often spun from the unexpected, the overlooked, the dismissed as insignificant. Think about the patterns emerging here. The Hyksos didn't just conquer Egypt, they forced innovation through humiliation. The Sogdians didn't just trade goods, they traded ideas, stitching continents together with contracts instead of conquests. The Anasazi's cliff dwellings weren't just architectural marvels, they were acts of defiance against a changing climate. These aren't footnotes, they're masterclasses in adaptation, showing us that survival hinges not on resisting change, but on embracing it creatively. What if we've been telling history backward? We focus on kings and battles while the real plot twists unfold in market stalls, scribbled chambers, and storm-lashed ships. The Library of Ashurbanipal didn't just preserve knowledge, it saved entire civilizations from oblivion. The quipu knots of the Inca didn't just track numbers, they encoded laws, stories, and warnings we're only now beginning to hear. These silent architects of history challenge us to look deeper, to question whose voices we've amplified and whose we've erased. So here's the invitation. Dive into the comments and share the forgotten moments that fascinate you. Maybe it's the Polynesian navigators who crossed oceans using star paths we've barely decoded, or the African metallurgists smelting steel in kilns centuries before Europe. Every culture holds these hidden turning points, the stories that don't fit neatly into textbooks but hold the keys to understanding how we got here. Because history isn't a single spotlight, it's a constellation of sparks, each one waiting to be seen.